Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gabriel Rosenfeld, president here at the Center for Jewish History. And if we could all just take our seats, we're looking forward to starting up with our wonderful symposium today, Translating Jewishness. In a brief second, I'm going to call up Professor Deborah Dash-Moore to the mic, and she'll give a formal introduction. But for a couple of seconds, you'll forgive me if I proudly say that today's event is part of our Jewish Public History Forum, which ever since we established it in April of last year, we've organized 7 major symposia on topics of historical significance that also have contemporary relevance. Those symposia have included everything from the Jewish response to fascism in the 30s and 40s, the American Jewish community's relationship to Zionism, and recently, this past April, we commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924 by talking at length with a variety of scholars, journalists, and other activists about the Jewish response to challenges and opportunities of immigration in American history. Before we turn matters over to today's topic, I do want to give you a couple of coming attractions. Starting in early 2025, as you all know, the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam is bringing really a blockbuster exhibit here to the center, which will open at the end of January. And in the context of that major event, we'll be sponsoring 2 series as part of the Jewish Public History Forum. The first is a panel discussion series called Anne Frank in History and Memory. And the second will be a film series about the Holocaust in post-war film, Anne Frank and beyond. So as always, we're doing things that are magnificent in the present, that are magnificent coming in the future as a coming attraction. But of course, we're here today to gather to celebrate the Posen Library's 7th volume and the exhibit that is out at the David Berg Rare Book Room, and of course, our conversation with our panelists, and to introduce them, and to introduce the agenda for today, Deborah Dash-Moore.
Thank you very much, Gav. So it's a real pleasure to welcome everyone to this symposium on translating Jewishness, Conversations on Culture and Civilization. This symposium explores the dynamics of translating and dimensions of the Jewish anthological imagination, both of which are intimately connected with the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. We have a stimulating afternoon ahead, filled with good conversation on these 2 key modes of translating Jewishness, followed by an opportunity to glimpse some of the challenges and rewards behind the creation of Volume 7 of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, co-edited by the distinguished historians Yisrael Bartal and Kenneth Moss, and published just this year. It's appropriate to begin with recognition of some of the most important folks who made this symposium possible, starting with Felix and Daniel Posen. Felix initiated the mammoth project that is the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. Daniel has not only continued to support the Posen Library's fulfillment, but also taken it into the digital realm. All the physical volumes that have been published to date, volumes 5 through 10, covering the years from 1500 to 2005, plus volume 1 on the biblical period, are available online free with registration. So I urge you to check out the many varied examples of Jewish culture and civilization using the QR code that is in your program on the inside cover. One of those examples that comes from the Posen Library was chosen as the image for this symposium. It's Jules Mordechai Paskin's The Turkish Family. Let me suggest that Paskin deftly translates Jewishness into a modern idiom in this painting. The term Turkish is likely a placeholder for a portrait of a modern Sephardic Jewish family like Paskin's own. Notably, the family members wear contemporary European fashions, particularly common among the non-Turkish bourgeoisies of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. One man, as you notice, doffs a top hat, while another on the painting's edge sports a fez, a marker simultaneously of loyalty to the Ottoman Empire and of aspirations to modernization and liberalization in Ottoman political and civic life. The artist himself exemplifies the extraordinary mobility of the years at the turn of the last century, especially for Jews. Born Jules Pinkas in Vidin, Bulgaria, to a Ladino-speaking family that drew its wealth from a grain business, he grew up in Bucharest. He received his artistic training in Vienna and Munich. He then moved to Montparnasse, neighborhood of Paris, where he became a fixture at Le Dôme Café with his new identity, Jules Pasquin. The start of World War I found Pasquin in the United States, returning in 1920 to Paris. You can get some sense of the Posen Library's breadth from an exhibit that is opening today right here at the Center for Jewish History. Please check it out during the coffee breaks or at the conclusion of the symposium during the reception. I think you'll find it offers a powerful interpretation of translating Jewishness. A different example of translating Jewishness appears on the cover of Volume 7 of the Posen Library. The volume traverses the years 1880 to 1918, aptly characterized as years of national renaissance and international horizons. As Bartal and Moss note, between 1880 and 1918, migration and imperialism remade the lives of millions. Nationalism and secularization transformed both selves and collectives, and new kinds of social conflict threatened as never before. This portrait by the Jewish painter Stanislav Stuckold of the German Jewish poet Elsa Lasker-Schuler captures her radiance. Stuckold's biography resembles in part aspects of Pasquin's, as he too traveled from his birthplace in Warsaw in a prosperous Jewish family, first to Berlin, then to London, then fleeing the Russian Empire to Munich, where he studied art, and then to Paris. Elsa Lasker-Schuler herself translated Jewishness through her modernist poetry, writing Hebrew melodies in German, and through her artwork. She drew the snake charmer in the Thebes marketplace around the time Stuckold painted her portrait. This sexually ambiguous figure approximated Lasker-Schuler's own self-perception, and she dressed herself in clothes that would suggest such gendered mutability. Moving in a milieu permeated by tropes that portrayed Jewish difference as Oriental or primitive or racial, and you'll see the air quotes there, Lasker-Schuler presented herself in poetry, in playful visual art, and in a cultivated public persona as Prince Yusuf, a time, ethnicity, and gender-bending composite of Jew and Muslim, Hebrew and Arabian, ancient Egyptian, and medieval Near Eastern man and woman. When viewed next to each other, we can see some of the range of creativity involved in translating Jewishness into visual terms. The 3 sessions of the symposium and the stunning exhibition would not have been possible without the dedicated work of 2 teams, one from the Center for Jewish History and the other from the Posen Library, who worked together to make it happen. I want to thank Rio Daniel, Ian Gray, Julie Kaplan, Shana Marchese, Sean Naftel, Ilana Rosenbluth, Gabriel Rosenfeld, and Gabriel Sanders, as well as all the folks from the center who are working behind the scenes this afternoon. And Lee Eskin, Maud Causadoy, Joyce Rappaport, Sarah Schechtman, and Rachel Weinstein from the Posen Library. We are grateful for the collaboration of the American Jewish Historical Society, the Leo Baeck Institute, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. As you will hear, we have drawn fine scholars together to speak about anthologizing, along with, I must confess, several of my wonderful colleagues at the University of Michigan, whom I could not resist tapping to discuss the challenges of translation. Thank you. And now for the first panel with the chair, Marcus Kraft from the from the Leo Baeck Institute.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Daniel, Posen, and I know that Felix and Jane will hopefully join us later. Thank you all for your interest in this. Thanks to our panelists. As you know, we're here to investigate the Jewish love affair with anthologies. Anthologies, of course, being the genre which gave us the foundational texts of the Jewish tradition, from the Bible or the Tanakh to the Talmud to the Siddur, modern compilations or anthologies, of which the Posen library is a prime example. So in the printed, thank you.
Sorry.
Great.
I moved it.
In the printed program, you already see references to a few aspects of how anthologies play such an outsized role in the Jewish tradition. I just want to reference a few more so we have a common point of reference before we turn to the panelists who can then address these issues by way of example of their own anthologies. So we will discuss on the stage for a while, and towards the end, we will open it up and we would like to hear your questions and comments as well. So obviously, there are practical utilitarian aspects of creating anthologies as teaching tools and in other ways, and I assume we will hear about those as well. Maybe more importantly, anthologies can have a canonizing effect or even purpose, something most obvious in the case of the Bible and other foundational sacred texts. They can be a vehicle to link texts and thinking across time and space, bringing different generations or different approaches, interpretive approaches together in dialogue, possibly with a thrust to advance their understanding and renew the relevance and meaning in a new time. The Talmud scholar Joseph Tabori calls the anthological principle a basic force that is likely, quote, inherent in a religion and culture that continuously faces the challenge of adapting traditional life to changing circumstances. Entirely new creations are considered a break in tradition, while new creations that are essentially anthologies of older material serve as a valid method of renewal within tradition. And this raises the question to what extent the Jewish love affair with anthologies is specifically Jewish, or if this could be said about other religious traditions facing the challenge of adapting to changing circumstances, and maybe particularly in the context of the Posen Foundation and Posen Library, one could also ask whether anthologies can have a secularizing effect or even purpose. There are other aspects to it which I will touch on very briefly. Anthologies can have a social function. Both David Roskis, who's on the second panel, and David Stern have used the term of imagined communities of readers and interpreters of various generations for which anthologies provide a space for dialogue. In this function, in this role, anthologies can serve as vehicles to provide the formation of ethnic or national or religious group identities. And all this, and now I'm turning to our panelists, is the result of the hard work of selecting, translating, editing, annotating, and presenting the texts, and all this after securing the rights, doing this between two book covers. This work, as some of you who have gone through it, can be hard and it can be thankless. It is often underappreciated. Anybody who has faced a tenure committee may know this. It can also be very underrated. literally from the stam, the silent compilers of the Talmud, all the way to modern times, which is makes it all the more important to have three editors who can speak about their various anthologies and bring to light some of the aspects we have mentioned. I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak here, I think. And you have fuller bios in your printed program, so bear with me and forgive me if I only mention their bios very briefly. I will start with Adriana Brodsky, who is at St. Mary's College of Maryland. She is the co-editor of Jews Across the Americas, a source book 1492 to the present. Next to her is Julia Phillips Cohen of Vanderbilt University in Nashville. She's the co-editor of Sephardi Lives, a documentary history 1700 to 1950. And to the far right, from your perspective, is Miriam Udell, Emory University, editor and translator of Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature. And you can see the... Okay. So, let me start by asking each of you the most basic question. Why did you put together this anthology? Why did you create it, maybe going beyond the utilitarian purposes as a textbook for teaching purposes?
Thank you so much for being here. It's actually very exciting to be sharing some of the experience with both the panelists, close friends of mine, and with you, the audience. Dr. Laura Liebman and I, we are the co-editors of this. We sat together at a conference held in February 2019. So this is one of the aspects of these anthologies that begin and then they take forever to actually be completed. And this was a panel, a conference on Jews and the Americas. And some of the things we sat down and we started thinking, wouldn't it be great to actually have a collection of documents that would allow our students to see the connections that we clearly were finding between what we were hearing from our colleagues and then people who we had in mind, whose work could be matched to some of the ideas that we were hearing at the conference. And so we really wanted a collection that looked at all the Americas. My expertise is Latin America, and then Laura Liebman's the United States and the Caribbean. And so our intention was to actually think along the complete continent and to imagine the Jewish experience as intrinsically connected with the whole continent, rather than follow national histories or at least imperial histories that kind of limited an experience that we knew was not contained by the boundaries of empires and nations. And then we started thinking that there was no collection of sources that also gave credit to the amount of work that people in the field of Jewish American history had actually been doing. The field started paying a lot of attention to transnationalism, to issues of gender, to issues of sexuality, to the voices of women. And we were kind of wondering that, that the collections of sources out there were not doing a very good job of translating that richness and those different themes into the documents that appeared out there. We also knew that the students that we were meeting in the classrooms were not the same as the students that were probably out there years before. Multiracial, Jews, multiracial households are a lot more common than they were in the past, and the students were not hearing some of those stories with the sources, the source books that existed. And in particular, we wanted to make sure that we could present a history of Jewish experience in the Americas that actually gave importance to the whole continent. If we were bound by the imperial or the national borders, we were providing stories that were incomplete, that began in the middle of something that was happening someplace else, and that the focus on these national or imperial boundaries were not making anybody see. And so, yes, in the United States, the history of Jews in the Americas begins in 1654. But yeah, those Jews are coming from Brazil, and they had an experience as Dutch, Jews. And we wanted to convey that the movement of Jews across these boundaries could not be captured unless we looked at the complete hemisphere. So those are the cases, that's the case with our collection.
Thank you. Julia, Sephardi Lives.
Yeah. Yeah. So I co-edited an anthology with my colleague Sarah Abravaya Stein from UCLA, and we had some parallel experiences, but one difference I'll say before we're kind of launching into the details of what we pursued is that we started this project quite some time ago, at least around 2010, probably earlier than that, actually. And so we were at a very different point in the field, especially in the field of modern Sephardi history, where it wasn't as if we were trying to reflect these broader trends in the field and encapsulate them and put them into our anthology. We were at a point in the field where the field of modern Sephardi history was really still just taking off. It was in a kind of early stage, and there wasn't a lot out there. And so we were responding to a kind of absence in a different respect as well, because I taught classes both in modern Jewish history and also taught classes such as one I've developed called Jews and Muslims. And in all of those classes, I didn't really have access to texts that represented my own field, which was the history of Sephardi or Ladino, Judeo-Spanish speaking Jews in the Balkans and Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean, kind of Ottoman world. There was a major source reader called The Jew in the Modern World, which had, at that time, almost nothing that dealt with Sephardi and Mizrahi studies. And there was a compilation by Norman Stillman called Jews of Arab Lands, and the Sephardi, Judeo-Spanish speaking world kind of fell between the proverbial cracks, and there was essentially just nothing to teach. So part of this was really driven by an absence. So we approached this project with the intention of being able to fill in those gaps and bring it at least to the very, at the very least into our own classrooms. And maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, Miriam, honey on the page.
Sure. So likewise, I feel very honored to be in this conversation with this company. And I think because Honey on the Page was published in October of 2020, 0 out of 10 stars, do not recommend publishing a book during the pandemic. There was a sense that, it had kind of a slow start in reaching its readership. So, every time it's able to be in conversation with other anthology projects, this might be the second time that's happened. It feels like a tremendous honor and opportunity. So I'm really grateful for that. Honey on the Page also began with a sense of absence and desire. In this case, there were parallel tracks of desire. I was teaching a Sprachkurs, a Yiddish language class, elementary Yiddish, and I was also raising at that time 2 young children. And both as a language instructor and as a mother, I found myself wondering, was there ever any Yiddish children's literature? Because there had been none that formed part of my education in Yiddish studies. And so I thought maybe it just didn't exist. And I decided to just kind of settle it one day, Google some stuff. And in the course of a single afternoon, I was shocked to realize that there were over 1,000 freestanding books, that there were at least 4 periodicals published in New York alone, some of which had print runs over several decades, and that barely any of this material had been translated, even as almost all of it was available, digitized online through the Yiddish Book Center, and even kind of cataloged in the Noah Posen online library. So it was all just sitting there as kind of low-hanging fruit for the plucking. And I thought, well, maybe none of it's any good, right? I'd better start reading before I make any commitments here. And I started reading, and as you would expect, some of it had aged not particularly well, felt very doctrinaire, was sort of hitting you on the head with its political ideology. Some of it hit you on the head with its political ideology in very subtle ways, but was also quite well crafted in literary terms. And then some of it was just beautifully written, not particularly ideologically driven children's literature. And I kind of looked around and said, well, you know, where are the grown-ups who are going to do something about this? Maybe there aren't any. Like, maybe, you know, for such a time as this, you were called. And so I wasn't really a translator at the time. I hadn't been trained in translation, but this was 2013. And the Yiddish Book Center was just launching its first cohort of the translation fellowship. And so I found out about it, and I thought maybe somebody can give me a little help and instruction in figuring out how to be the translator that I clearly need to be in the world. And so I started working on the anthology. The title came to me pretty quickly. We'll talk, I think we'll have a chance to get into, you know, contents and organization. That took a long time to figure out. And it was also very clear to me from early on that this needed to be both a project for students and scholars on the one hand, and for families interested in Yiddish and in the Jewish past on the other hand, and that by hook or by crook, I was going to figure out, or at least attempt to figure out, how to bridge this gap.
Let's get to the question of how you organize the material. We heard in the first round about the intentions, and we know that you didn't start from scratch. There were other anthologies out there, or there was plenty of material which you decided to put together. So how did you organize this, and what were the considerations that went into the decisions how to organize your material?
So one of the first things we, with Laura, what we decided is that we trusted our colleagues so much that we just put a very broad call out there, and we said, all right, if you were to choose one source from all the ones that you've been working with in the last few years, which one would you like to share with students? And so that was the beginning. We started receiving, you know, a list, you know, tons of sources with a very short explanation as to what our scholars, what our friends saw in those sources. And so we started organizing them, dividing them chronologically. And that actually gave us the broad decision that we were going to go with a chronological order. We wanted to, you know, for the readers and the students to be able to understand and to work through, right, a chronology and trying to, you know, to actually work at being historians themselves. And so, as you can see here, these are 2 pages from the index. And so we had we organized it, all the sources into 5 chronological sections. The colonial era from 1492 to 1764, the age of revolutions and emancipation from 1765 to 1826, the era of mass migration and nationalism from 1827 to 1912, the world at war from 1913 to 1945, and then lastly, Jews in the post-war Americas from 1946 to the present. Each of these chronological sections actually begin with an introduction that Dr. Liebman and I wrote to help students understand the historical context of the period and to pull at some of the themes that we wanted the readers to pay attention to as they moved from chapter to chapter. And then, as you can see from some of the titles here, these sections have chapters or sources. So each chapter is one source, which, if you can move to the next slide, so you get a sense of one of the chapters. So we have an introductory section, which was written by the expert who shared with us their source. And the introduction that they wrote pretty much focused on the answers to very important questions for us. What is the original context of the work? What does the source contribute to the local Jewish history that you are writing about? And then what does it add to the story of American Jewry more broadly across time and space? Then, in this case, we have one of the 3 photographs that Natasha Zaretsky shared with us on this particular topic, the bombing of the Jewish Community Center. In this case, they're not translated into English because they're photographs. In cases in which it was textual and it was written in a language other than English, they were translated by the authors, the ones that were sharing the source with us. And then last but not least, we included a series of questions that helped us guide the readers into thinking about a particular theme or a particular type of source, how to work with a particular type of source thematically and across the different time periods. We also wanted to make sure that students were able to work with similar types of sources across time. And again, here is one of our objectives. We wanted students to also learn how to do history, how to understand, how to read different sources. And so we made sure, and whenever we just found a gap in terms of, okay, so we have love letters from the colonial period. Do we know somebody that we can ask who has worked with love letters in the national period? And so we would then target specific colleagues who knew that could provide that coverage in terms of type of sources. And then importantly, we also relied on the expertise of our colleagues. We relied on their excitement about the sources they were sharing with us. We relied on their translations in the cases when they translated. And we hoped to be able to put together a collection of sources that represented variety in terms of where these scholars were at. We have scholars from all over the world. We have scholars who are at institutions where they are tenured, scholars who are not tenured. And so we also wanted to make sure that the book provided that variety in terms of our experts.
Julia.
Yeah, so when we set out to do the project, once we had committed to it, we settled upon the idea of trying to target about 150 short translations or sources that represented the breadth of modern Sephardi history from 1700 to 1950. And in addition to kind of trying to address the idea that Sephardi voices had been missing in translation and in anthologies, we were really committed to creating an anthology that would represent the entirety of modern Sephardi society, which meant looking beyond models of anthologies that privileged elite authors of texts, whether they be religious, political, or intellectual, and trying to get at sources that represented the perspectives and experiences of impoverished people, women, children, and a whole range of people from the modern Sephardi world. So we had to tackle, of course, the question of how to organize the book. And we settled upon something that was related but different. We ended up with 6 chapters that were organized more thematically, and within each chapter it moves chronologically. So I realize that maybe the text here is too small for people to see. So I'll just pull out a few examples from this slide. It is a compilation of 3 different non-consecutive pages from our table of contents. So let me just very briefly say that because we were committed to including sort of social history, histories of everyday life, and so on, we created and sort of privileged that category in the first major section, which we entitled Everyday Life on the Street and in the Synagogue from Court to Courtyard. And I'll read you a few of the earliest titles with which we begin. One is entitled A Calamitous Earthquake Hits Izmir, 1688. The next is A Will from Rashid, Egypt. And the next is Manumission of a Jewish Slave in Salonika from 1700. A rabbi in Istanbul interprets the Bible for Ladino readers. I'll skip ahead. So 1730, these are from some of the early periods. I'll skip ahead to Lessons for a Child, in your honor, Miriam. Lessons for a Child, a Ladino Guide to Modern Living from 1778. So this gives you a very brief window into that section. After that, we had a section that dealt with regional transformations and wars in the Balkans and southeastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Another that dealt with political and ideological movements. So getting into some of the more familiar terrain from perhaps more traditional anthologies, political manifestos, ideological positions. We had another section devoted entirely to World War II and the Holocaust and the Sephardi experience of that period. And 2 final chapters that dealt with Sephardi diasporic and emigre circles, getting into your territory now, in the Americas, in Europe, across Africa, and elsewhere. And a final section that dealt with the birth of Sephardi studies. So we wanted to think conceptually about how not only this world was once lived and constituted, but how we have come to know it and the history of that process. So that's what we settled upon for our organization.
Okay, Miriam.
Okay, so with respect to organization, I was very aware of what an interdisciplinary project this was. And I thought, if I organize it according to the ideologies that generated these various texts, that will make historians very happy. About the number of people in this room now would have been like deliriously happy. If I organize it according to genre, then I will make the literary scholars very happy. So take like half of the number of people in this room, and those people would be thrilled. If I organize it according to the target age of the reader, then the developmental psychologists would be delighted. And maybe that's like a minion of people, right? So I wanted this to become a book that would be in every synagogue library in the land and many public libraries, to say nothing of nurseries and homes. And so I thought that the right way to go with organization was a mix of theme and genre. And I looked to the anthologies that were popular during the first decade of Yiddish publishing for children, really the period from 1910 to 1920, when there were a lot of anthologies and also what were called chrestomathies, which are anthologies with a very specific kind of educational intent that sort of lead you through a sequence. And the pattern that I was seeing in these chrestomathies was that the collections would move from the more particularly Jewish, very kind of inward turned, insider baseball, and they would expand out from there to more universal themes, and then sometimes they would loop back again. And I thought, I'm going to follow that sort of general movement. So the beginning of the book is about Jewish holiday tales and the cycle beginning with Passover after the biblical fashion of starting the year in the spring. And then it moves on to Jewish history, which means that the second section of the book tends to have the pieces for the most sophisticated readers, because what Yiddish writers would put before young teens 85 and 100 years ago was a lot of Jewish history, somewhat tendentiously related. And from there, it goes on to wonder tales, tales of magic, and it just kind of keeps getting more and more universal. Tales of school, going to school. And when I say tales, it's also a little bit of poetry. And then learning outside of school. And then finally, at the end, we have family life, because that's really the kind of most universal set of themes. And the other fun aspect to organizing these texts was figuring out how to make them come alive visually in a way that might be compelling for contemporary children, or at least contemporary children with extremely nerdy parents, which turns out to be the true market for my book. So you see here a beautiful illustration by Hermann Kruk of the chickens who wanted to learn Yiddish, because the chickens realized that the two children who lived on their farm were disappearing every day after school and no longer coming to play with them. So they had one of the smaller chickens follow the kids and learn that a shule had been established for the children of the poultry farming community of Toms River, New Jersey. And the chickens had a meeting and they said, "Do we not belong to a Jewish farmer? Do we not deserve to learn Yiddish?" And so they sent one of the chickens to the shule in the pocket of one of the children. And that chicken would come back and teach all the other chickens. So you have that illustration. And then, of course, we have the mutt that we all need for this moment. This is Leipzig, Chaver Paver's Proletarian Pup, published in 1935. 12 linked stories about the adventures that this family goes on together with this kind of leftist lassie. I've translated, two of the stories appear in Honey on the Page. I've translated all 12. SUNY is putting them out 10 months from whenever I finalize and get my act together, but hopefully about September, October of next year. And if we just show one more slide, I was able to commission some new illustrations by the late Paula Cohen, and this was her personal favorite. This is a Shloima Simon story that I translated as "A Deal's a Deal." The husband and wife in the story have had a fight over who's going to go downstairs and bolt the door on a windy night, because the wind is making the door bang. And they're both very stubborn, and they make this deal that whoever speaks first is going to have to go down and shut the door. So they're really kind of locked into their hardened positions upstairs. Neither one of them will say a word, and neither one of them will shut the door. And in the middle of the night, thieves come in through the open door and they clean them out. And they can hear the whole thing happening, but neither one of them wants to lose the bet. And you'll have to see what happens the next day. I'm not going to ruin it for you. But figuring out how to break up the 8 sections with these newly commissioned illustrations was also part of the fun. Oh, yeah, it harkens back to this this really venerable ceremony of initiating a child, particularly a boy, into his formal education by having him lick honey either from a tablet or the pages of a very simple Aleph-based book.
Great. Now, as you went through the process of putting the specific anthologies together, you must have reflected about some of the questions we touched upon at the beginning. The canonizing purpose or effect of such an anthology. The intention to shed new light or create an entirely new perspective on a neglected topic or a topic that needed an updated perspective. Can you share with us some of the challenges you faced, maybe by specific examples, like a hard decision which text or which document to include at the cost of another one that had to go out, and how this related to these larger questions we're discussing today?
Sure. Well, Laura and I ended up working with 80 contributors. So talk about challenges right there from the start, just getting everybody on the page. So anyway, that was one that we gladly welcomed, because again, as we mentioned, the book, as it came out, could not have been done without the headache that working with 80 contributors entails. We realized from the very beginning that the project required, of course, not just the translation from languages other than English into English, but also because we were bringing in historical contexts from regions that a lot of the readers were not going to have background information on, that there was an important job of providing cultural as well as historical contextualization. And so we kind of, again, worked with the contributors to see what they had found important to contextualize in their sources, and then again, always have in mind us writing the introduction to the geographical, to the chronological sections, to make sure that we kind of filled in the gaps that had been left unwittingly by the contributors. We, in cases when some of the sources were fantastic that they sent us first, but we understood the amount of text space it was going to take for us to contextualize and be able to provide material that would be read within a context that we knew, many people would not have on their own. Sometimes we had to forego fantastic sources because of that. And in the cases when we have, people who could not just send us one source they wanted to share, but 10 sources that they wanted to share, we ended up creating a website that accompanies the book. And that is where, we would put the sources that would not fit in the already 500-page collection. But also we wanted to make sure that those who could read in the original language of the sources could actually go to the website and see the original text itself. And so sometimes what happens, when you're translating text and you print it on a page, you lose the materiality of the object, right? You can't see, the scribbles of a note, the smudges, the torn pages. And so whenever possible, even when they were in another language, we added those onto the website to provide and to kind of overcome that challenge of losing, the materiality of the text. We also wanted, again, to provide similar sources so that, again, the students, the reader, would be able to kind of follow, right, how to read letters, across this, various times, and then come up with arguments about, well, how have letters, changed from the beginning of times until the present? We wanted students to also be thinking in terms of, history as, a narrative of places and things, into, history as making arguments based on sources. And for that, we needed and we wanted, to provide similar types of sources, photographs, letters, advertisements, throughout the whole chronological period. And so that was something that we needed to make sure existed. And then also, equal coverage was not possible because centers of Jewish life in the continent shifted, depending on what time. And so we're going to start with some chapters in which the presence of, sources from the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire, of course, are going to be, prevalent. Then, when we move to the 18th century, it is the Caribbean that becomes the center for Jewish history. And so, the Dutch Empire, Suriname, all these Curaçao, all these regions that are kind of appear significantly in one particular time period are going to disappear later on because the centers of Jewish life continued to switch. And then last but not least, equal coverage was also not possible in many cases because sometimes the professional, let's say, construction of these narratives, those are not equal. So even though the production on Latin American Jewish history, Latin American Jewish culture has grown exponentially in the last few years, there's still some areas where there just not yet has been, the discussion of certain topics that we would have wanted to add, but the, scholarship is not there yet. And so some of those silences were the product of a kind of lagging, scholarship production, as well as, the fact that in Latin America, some of the archives and institutions are not, people don't donate things to institutions. And so, the lagging in scholarship also is the result of some structural differences that unfortunately are there. And we have to sometimes accept these lacunas for the moment.
So some of the challenges that we had, certainly, once again, rhyme with yours. We worked with a team of 40 collaborators, and we also set out to do a lot of the scouring of archives ourselves. So Sarah, my colleague, and I took materials from previous work that we had both done, drew upon that, but we also took to the stacks and started searching for sources that might fit the kind of categories that we saw that were missing. So I spent some time, looking desperately for a text that reflected Ottoman Jewish engagement with feminism and the sort of rise of feminist ideas, because no one had written about it. So one of the things that we ended up kind of doing in the process of working on this project was we eventually, after the book came out, described it as the process of kind of inventing a canon. So rather than having a sort of an already established body of materials that we could synthesize and put together, it was our job to figure out what the key texts were in these different areas, which was daunting and quite a responsibility, but also, of course, very freeing in the sense that we got to choose, right? There wasn't any kind of inherited wisdom or even really a set of texts that had been decided upon. One of the things that we were really committed to was keeping the book affordable. We wanted it to be out in paperback and accessible so that people would be able to buy it in not just libraries. And one of the things that meant for us, which we do regret, which was a trade-off, was that we didn't include images in the book. And so that was one of our challenges. It was a choice we made at the time. It might be something that we would approach differently now, but at the time, that was the kind of, factoring in of page numbers and costs and so on. And I'll say that there was one exception to that, and that is the image that graces the cover of the book, which we thought long and hard about because it was the only image that we were able to provide. And we were really happy to land upon this because, as you can see, the book is supposed to, of course, represent the sort of variety of modern Sephardi experiences. And even though these series of pictures of two Sephardi siblings only represent two people, they represent them at different moments, experiencing different feelings, engaging with each other, also on their own. And so we felt that it encapsulated some of the spirit of what we wanted to do, and also this pivot that we were making in our anthology to look to children and to women and to other people who didn't usually get to be put into collections like this. And finally, the last thing I'll say that we were very happy about with this image is that this is an image of two Sephardi siblings who were from the former Ottoman Empire and had their family had immigrated to Seattle. This is a picture of them in 1910. Their names are Emma and Albert Adato, and we were able to include texts by both of them in the reader because as they grew up, they both did graduate work and studied the Sephardi community of Seattle, and each of their texts are in our Birth of Sephardi Studies chapter. So that was our solution.
Miriam.
So the first challenge, significant challenge, was that although it was evident to me right away that this book needed to exist, and I understood the sort of broad outlines of what it ought to be, nobody wanted this book. Not trade presses, not scholarly presses. I had it shopped around. I sort of buttonholed editors from academic presses. And my favorite piece of feedback that came to me through an agent was, well, there's that Beatrice Weinreich folktale collection from 1974, so I think it's already covered. And these are not folktales for the most part. Some of them are adapted folktales. I will say that in the sort of longer arc of this book's existence in the world, the joke really is on me because just last week, the book it had its most viral moment ever. It reached a larger audience than it ever has before. Is anyone familiar with Miriam Anzovin, who does DAF reactions? She sort of translates Talmud into millennial speak, and she has a new series called Jewish Folklore Reactions. So she did a review video of Honey on the Page, and she posted it last week. And she really read it very deeply and sensitively and understood exactly what I was trying to do. And the video review is kind of a love letter to the book in a way that, to be honest, made me tear up a little bit. But she received it as folklore. And I find that fascinating. I keep protesting, it's not folklore, but if you're paying, I mean, all of a sudden sales spiked, like it was great, no complaints. So just having people share the vision for the book or understand what it could be was a challenge. And then the other thing that it's more of a trade-off, as Julia was talking about, than a challenge, since I did want it to be something that could be put before the contemporary child, it couldn't be entirely representative. There were authors that I thought were important canonical authors from Yiddish literature from adults who, all things being equal, I would have loved to see represented in the volume. But what they wrote for children was gefährlich. It was just terrible. David Hofstein has a beautifully wrought poem about a kitten, an adorable gray and white kitten with soft little triangular ears. But about 2/3 of the way through the poem, the owners go out, the kitten's in the courtyard, and down comes the hawk and tears apart the kitten into shreds. Like, I'm not putting that in my anthology and handing it to my kids, right? So that was one of those trade-offs where it's going to be less representative, but it's going to be more of a product to nurture the children that we have in our communities today.
Thank you. We want to leave some time for a Q&A, so I would have one final question and requesting short answers from all three of you. Now that you know more than before about the other two anthologies, which you did not edit or co-edit, what commonalities or overlap do you see in the kind of intervention that these anthologies suggest in what we know about the respective topics in the move forward of scholarship and our knowledge and understanding of those topics? And if you expand this beyond the immediate effect that you may see to what could be hopefully an afterlife of your anthologies, could you, just the three of you, speak about this, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Well, very briefly, I think that we were all, wanting to bring voices to the public, voices that had not been presented as much as we thought they should. I think that this kind of, speaks to our three, attempts. I also think that there was a sense of the usage, right? These books being able to be put to use, in the case of Julia's and mine, perhaps in the classroom. In the case of Miriam, in the homes, right, to be read to the children, so that there is a hope that they are not just fulfilling a wish that they represent some of the voices that we think are not there, but that we also want them to be used by those for whom we imagined these collections. I'm just going to bring it.
Yeah, I would just reiterate, and I'll say very briefly, that bringing in a diversity of voices and experiences into our understanding of what modern Jewish culture and life is enriching for everyone, right? We were sort of, and I hope that the task continues among various others beyond our three cases. If I could say something very briefly about the question of afterlives, I brought one more image, and I have started using Sephardi Lives in the classroom, and I, ironically, because of the kind of opposite order in which we did things, where we really didn't have an established canon and put things together on the fly, really, Sarah and I both, and I hope other people also, are turning back to the book, not just for teaching, but for our own research purposes, because we included a lot of texts in there that had never been known, discussed, translated, published before. And so I'm just bringing in one example, small example here, of a text on the left, and I'll read the title for those of you who can't see it well. I entitled it "A Sephardi Suffragette." We did. A Jewish Woman of Izmir, Lectures on Feminism from 1913. That's the text I found when I was scouring the library shelves. And we knew almost nothing about the author. The text had never been known. And so I decided just more recently to pick up her story again and try to pursue it further. And I wrote a short think piece about her, which is coming out in a few weeks in the Jewish Quarterly Review. Here's the cover, the title, first page of that article. I entitled it "Ottoman Jewish Feminism in Print and Practice, the Paradoxical Life and Ideas of Graziella Ben-Ghiat." So I've returned to the text, and I hope others will consider doing similar things because this is, in a way, for me, it's still kind of it's a extension of an archive that hasn't fully been tapped and explored. And I'll just explain. The picture in the middle is, there are no remaining pictures of her. A lot of her work has been lost due to fires and movement and wars. This is a picture of her son. It's the closest thing we have to an image of her and some connection to her life, but I was able to interview her grandson and try to reconstruct her story a little bit just recently, even after the book came out.
So I want to pick up right there and say that research on children's literature and culture has been gender studies by other means. There is a desire to include more women's voices in this proposed canon. An anthology kind of intrinsically proposes a canon, even if it's deeply in tension with the ideas of a canon and the way that that excludes. I included biographical information about every one of the 27 authors who wrote 47 pieces in Honey on the Page. And there were 3 cases where there were female writers who were either absent from the 8-volume lexicon of Yiddish writers or about whom there was the tiniest paragraph. And in 3 of the cases, I learned about those female authors through their sons. Two became literature professors who wrote memoirs that each included a chapter on their respective mothers. And one I was able to interview. So that's a way that I think our work syncs up. And as far as the afterlives, because, as I told you, nobody really saw the vision for this book until it was very far along, I've basically been lying to people since 2013. I lied, but in service of a larger truth, a local lie, but a global truth. I always said that I was working on the critical study of this literature and what it meant for the study of Ashkenazi modernity. That is true. The week before last, that critical study went into production. It should be out next September. So there will be modern Jewish world making through children's literature available in about 10 months. And I think that the method that I developed could not have existed without the translation work. I call it literary studies from within, which is supposed to be somewhat akin to history from below. I feel like through translation, I really got inside of these texts, how they were working, what kind of work they were attempting to do in the world. And so I'm very much hoping that the afterlife of Honey on the Page is bound up with this modern Jewish world-making project.
Thank you. We now have some time for questions and comments. There will be microphones available going around. Maybe we'll start in the front right here.
Thank you. What a fascinating topic. I remember Professor Ronnie Natov, who pioneered the study of children's literature. She was at Brooklyn College. But my question has to do with fairy tales. In Ashkenazi Jewry, in the Yiddish literature in particular, were there any translations of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales? And in Sephardi children's literature, were there any translations or original stories of the Arabian Nights?
So translations of European literature is really the entry point before there is an independent literature originating in Yiddish for young readers. There's a wonderful article by Chona Shmeruk where he talks specifically about this fairy tale tradition, and he talks about the Brothers Grimm being translated into Yiddish. And there is a range of translational practices having to do with the level of Judaization of the text or not. So do you swap out the kind of cultural markers of Christianity for Jewish cultural markers, like mentions of Jewish holidays or clothing items or sites, locales in a given town? So that was very present. My work really picks up in the moment after that with the works that originate in Yiddish.
I'll just say briefly, I don't know if I have an answer right off the top of my head, because one thing that I should clarify about the book is that we called it a documentary history, so we weren't really actually translating literary texts, and I don't know that that work has been done, but maybe others will have something to add. I really don't know how much work has been done on that topic, so we'll see if anyone in the audience wants to add anything.
The gentleman over there.
Two-part question. The first part a little bit, both techie, and I have no tech background, so it'll be fairly primitive. But obviously, with the onset of the internet, there are ways of expanding what you can provide that are much richer and broader than just what is in the book. Not that what's in the book is not sufficient, but you can go to creating a website and have hot links. And in the Sephardic book, you said you couldn't do images. Well, you can do images on hot links if if they don't fit in the book, you can still provide them. So any thoughts or experiences on how that's working? I would imagine it gives you access to a whole bunch of additional authors that just don't fit in the book that you can also still present. And the second question is real simple. Do you see AI creeping in at all in any of this?
So our website was primarily, imagined as a place where we could honor the contributors' choices, right? So they provided us with 10 photographs of tombstones in the Mexican Jewish cemeteries, and we were limited as to how many we could actually print. And so we started first initially thinking about the website as a place where all these other sources that could not fit, right, the price or, would end up going to. And then it actually morphed thinking into, we created a section for the students. And so there's there's flashcards with a glossary, there's questions for the students. There's takeaways from each, for the students who are reading, the chapters, chronological chapters, and then what are the takeaways that they need to remember about this particular time period in connection with Jewish history. And so, and then again, importantly for us, we wanted for those people who had the linguistic ability to read the documents that had been translated in their original, we also wanted people to enjoy what the original document looked like, for those. And so, because we believe in the sort of the weight of the materiality of the text, and that is also only conveyed, right, whenever, the text is available on the website. And so we have added, within the website, we have added links, and we send our students back to the book, and then from the book, we send them back, to the website. And so there's movement there, between this other resource, which it lives on the web, and then the book itself.
I'm reminded of the time by a shot clock in the back, which has turned red, which makes me fear that the next stage will be electroshocks here up on the stage. So I want to thank you all, in particular the panelists. Before you applaud, I want to invite you. Oh, go ahead. Thank you again to the three of you, to the great questions, and please come back to the next panel at 2:30, and books are available for purchase in the Great Hall outside. Thank you all for coming, 2:30, and the editors are willing to cite them, to autograph them for you. Thank you.